Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and from viewers like you.
Hello and welcome to Louisiana Public Square. I'm Beth Courtney, President of LPB. With us tonight to moderate our discussion on Louisiana's Coastal Master Plan is longtime television anchor and our friend Andre Morrow.
Beth, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. You know, last week, Governor John Bel Edwards officially declared a state of emergency for Louisiana's coast. The declaration goes next to President Donald Trump and then Congress. The goal is to raise the profile of the state's coastal land loss, plus speed up the federal permitting process for projects in Louisiana's 2017 Coastal Master Plan.
Well, but before those actions take place, the coastal plan needs to receive approval from the state legislature. It will need to pass through the Transportation and Natural Resources committees of both chambers before going to the legislators for an up or down vote. Tonight, we hope to help inform you about what's in the plan, the concerns that citizens have about some of the projects, and how it will all be funded. Here's a preview. Louisiana's 2017 Coastal Master Plan goes before the legislature this session for approval. The plan represents the best investment for the state's coast, according to Bryn Haas with the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. He's pleased with how the plan, which the CPRA developed, tackles the multiple challenges from coastal land loss.
A number of different projects in the plan. Barrier Island projects, of course, very important as our first line of defense. Dredging projects to help build marshes, ridges, sediment diversion projects to help reconnect the river with its deltaic plain, shoreline protection projects, hydrologic restoration projects, oyster reefs, quite a variety of different kinds of projects.
The 2017 plan dedicates half of its $50 billion price tag to hurricane protection and risk reduction projects. The other half covers 124 projects that are estimated to build more than 800 square miles of land over 50 years. These include plans like the Barataria sediment diversion.
And so the idea behind that project is to help rebuild some of those wetlands, to help provide that, again, first line of defense against those storm surges, and provide habitat for things that we like, fish, wildlife, and so forth. The point is that we understand that we need to get those projects on the ground now. We need to get them on the ground sooner rather than later.
One delay in doing that is funding. One income stream will be the nearly $140 million Louisiana will receive annually from oil and gas lease revenue sharing beginning in 2019. Louisiana also will be receiving $10.7 billion over the next 15 years in settlements from the BP oil spill.
Most of those dollars come to us in the form of grants. And so they're dollars that we have to expend and then apply for grants to reimburse. The misconception, again, is that all those dollars are in a bank somewhere in the state and we're just sitting on them, and that's simply not the case.
One way to speed things up would be to have private firms finance construction costs up front, then be repaid by the state in installments. Louisiana Congressman Garrett Graves is hoping to put coastal projects on President Donald Trump's federally funded infrastructure list.
This is a national priority and it's a national liability. And I would say more so than a lot of these other projects that are getting more funding than we are. So it's something that we've had some very positive discussions with the administration about. We're going to keep talking to them about them, but really need to grow that scope of what they view as being infrastructure.
Another delay has to do with permitting. In January, the Barataria sediment diversion project received a Fast 41 designation to streamline the federal process. But an environmental impact statement must be completed by the Corps of Engineers before permitting can begin.
Typically, we follow the NEPA process, the National Environmental Protection Act laws that were enacted by Congress and made into federal law. Those laws are literally 90 plus or minus individual laws that cover all types of specific environmental issues, and all those have to be addressed.
Brad Inman works for the Restoration Branch of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers New Orleans District. He says agencies like the EPA, Fish and Wildlife, and National Marine and Fisheries must look at the project to determine if there's an impact to the resources they administer.
So the intent is to move as expeditiously as possible. However, we have to meet all the environmental laws and requirements that are mandated. Otherwise, at the end of the day, if somebody would decide to take would take a legal action against the project, if we have missed anything administratively, that would cause real problems.
Even with the accelerated process, the Corps announced on March 15th that it will need until at least 2022 to complete the reviews needed to permit the diversion project.
We think 2022 is too long to wait. We want to get those projects on the ground sooner rather than later.
In March, Governor Edwards asked President Trump to add the project and 4 others under his January executive order, fast-tracking environmental reviews for high-priority infrastructure projects. And last week, the governor declared the Louisiana coast in a state of emergency. An agreement from the Trump administration and Congress will speed up state and federal permitting and possibly exclude restoration projects from some environmental laws.
You're going to need some diversions to contribute. There's no two ways about that. But you have to control them to control the salinity. If you want to build the islands back or the land back, I think pumping or dredging from the river is the fastest way to do it.
Don Bichelle owns a marina in Pointe a la Hache. Recreational and commercial fishermen complain that diversion projects destroy seafood habitat. A recent U.S. Geological Survey report says large-scale diversions may significantly change water quality, affecting shellfish. The 2017 master plan calls for 8 sediment diversion projects. Haas says the plan acknowledges concerns about seafood habitat.
We're certainly proud of the fact that Louisiana has a working coast, and we're trying to preserve that. But in trying to preserve that, often that means changing some of the environmental conditions that lie along our coast, which could impact things like fisheries, certainly oysters, areas where oysters can survive. And by and large, most resources, oysters, fish, and so forth, are better off with the plan in place than they are without the plan in place over the long term.
No matter how the vote in the legislature turns out, Haas says the master plan will continue to be as dynamic as the coast it aims to protect.
Make no mistake about it, whether we implement the coastal master plan or don't implement the coastal master plan, this coast is going to change, and those changes will affect things like where we fish, where we live, where we recreate.
Joining us now for a dynamic discussion on the 2017 master plan is our studio audience. Now, it includes representatives from the Audubon Society, the National and State Wildlife Federations, and the shrimp and oyster industries. We've also got coastal advocates, plus a geologist, a hydrologist, a disaster ecologist is here. A statewide poll on Louisiana's coastal issues was conducted for the National Audubon Society last month. Those surveyed include residents from both coastal areas in the south and non-coastal areas up in the northern part of the state. Here are a look at some of the responses from them. 67% of respondents say they aren't currently personally affected by coastal land loss. 32% of the respondents say they are. But when asked if coastal land loss will personally affect them in the future, well, the numbers flip-flop, with 74% of those saying yes and 21% saying no. 5%, well, they weren't sure about that. When asked to rank the most severe threats from coastal land loss, 85% of respondents say that it poses a very serious threat to communities subject to hurricane storm surges. 79% of respondents feel the next severe threat is to coastal wildlife and fisheries, and 77% of those surveyed, well, they rank the next severe threat to the culture of a coastal community. And finally, an overwhelming opinion of 88% of all respondents is that they want their state legislator to vote to approve the state coastal master plan. 4% want their legislator to vote no. There are 8% of those that are not sure. So let's start there. Do you support or oppose the state master plan, and why? I'm going to begin now with Sydney Coffey, Senior Advisor to America's Wetland Foundation. And Sydney, during that piece just a moment ago, I saw you kind of shaking your head at some of the answers. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, Probably when you saw me shaking my head, it was about the delay in the feasibility study. I mean, it's just like, wow, by the Corps. That's unacceptable, completely unacceptable. And I'm very, first of all, I want to, say right off the bat, of course, America's Wetland Foundation is 100% behind the master plan. And the urgency of the situation, though, right now is what we have to deal with. The master plan has evolved incredibly since its inception. And it is at a place right now where you're really, I think the public will be able to know real timelines, have a better sense of what's really going to happen, and what's really not going to be able to happen. But on the things that are important, like these diversion projects, the urgency is everything. That's why I'm so excited about the emergency declaration by the governor. If this can raise that awareness at the national level and let them understand that this is a continuing natural disaster that's taking place, natural and unnatural, I might say. But if the public can get that, and Congress can really get that, and understand how urgent it is, to deal with this problem, they'll also understand that the entire nation, every citizen in our country, is impacted by what's happening on this coast and also benefits from it.
It seems a little unusual, too, to say it's urgent, but then you're going to wait 5 more years before you do something.
It's ridiculous.
It's either urgent or it isn't, right?
That's right. And this could help speed up that process considerably.
Oh, okay. Cindy, thank you very much. Talk again to you. Let me ask Mitch, what are your thoughts on this question? Are we on the right track?
Well, as representing the oystermen of the state, we have some issues with the major sediment diversions that are planned for the master plan. We do know there are going to be some impacts, and it's going to be significant impacts. And to kind of relay some of the thoughts about why it's taken so long for the Corps. Well, the socioeconomic impact studies were not included in the beginning of these planning phases, and we need those. We need to see what kind of impacts are going to happen to the coast, to the communities, and to our seafood. Till we get a better handle on are we going to be able to survive or are we not going to be able to survive? We need those answers, and I think that's one of the delays in this whole process is we didn't get that socioeconomic impact study done in time, and we're still waiting on that study to be completed.
Rebecca, Trish, let me ask you your thoughts on this. You represent State Wildlife and Fisheries.
So yes, it's Louisiana Wildlife Federation, and our members are outdoor enthusiasts, hunters, anglers, hikers, and boaters. And we recognize that South Louisiana is a system of estuaries, and where the river system has built all of that from the freshwater further north in the system down to the coastal zone. What makes Sportsman's Paradise is the vastness of our saltwater marsh. That's what is so beneficial to fisheries. And so, a coastal master plan that is so complex and recognizes a comprehensive view and using the river as much as we can to mimic that process is really important. It's something that our organization has looked at and supports in terms of sediment diversions as well as freshwater diversions in key areas that are suffering from saltwater intrusion and subsidence. So it's important, repairing and sustaining our habitat for wildlife and fisheries is just as valuable for people as well as wildlife.
All right, Rebecca, thank you very much. Chris McClendon, the diversion projects, tell me about that if you would.
Well, I'll come to the defense of the Corps of Engineers. How about that? It's important to understand that they're charged with producing an environmental impact statement that's ultimately going to have to stand up in federal court. And that means that they have to have looked at every aspect of this. And as a geologist, as a member of the New Orleans Geological Society, I can say that there are aspects that have just not been considered to date. What is the geological structure at the site of the diversion? I saw a presentation last week at the Louisiana Association of Environmental Professionals showing geological faults in the area of the diversion. So I think the Corps is aware of that. I think there is a great amount of uncertainty about what subsidence rates are in the vicinity of some of these projects. and how they're going to respond to sediment. Our concept is we're going to load sediment into one area. How is the subsurface geology going to respond to that? And I think those are all things that need to be looked at.
Absolutely. Yeah. Dr. Linda Bowie, there is a new enemy among us right now that a lot of people are not aware of, and you can tell us about that.
There's a scale insect that's accused of ravishing the rosio canes, and the rosio canes is multi-species of those tall canes with the long green leaves that you see, and they populate the birdfoot of the delta at the end of the Mississippi River all the way up Plaquemines Parish and across the rest of the coast of Louisiana. And this little insect is sucking the juice out of the cane, and it's destroying large areas. They're saying over 80% of the cane is gone when we need the cane to hold on to the sediment.
These are the marshes that we
see, that
right?
we fish, where we hunt birds and ducks and things like that. And so this is something we're just getting a handle on. It was discovered, I believe, by Earl Armstrong, a local landowner, and some fishing guides in South Plaquemines Parish, and they alerted the proper authorities. It's just been recently identified as an invasive species. And but I would, I've seen things like this happen before, and if you could see the aerial photographs that were just taken last week, it is what I would call ecological meltdown. And so the declaration of disaster couldn't have come at a better time. But this is like a disaster within a disaster. We are losing huge swaths of land because the cane is literally knocked over, and the roots were holding on to sediment, and it's accelerated the land loss.
That is the worst of the news we could hear.
Yeah.
People are having to relocate, and Matthew, you can address that, because some people that called a certain place home are not going to be able to stay there.
Well, certainly. Also due to coastal land loss from loss of vegetative growth, climate change will play a large impact in displacing, folks that are living and enjoy the coast. And that's part of what my work does at LSU as a researcher, as a climate change researcher. And the Coastal Master Plan is great in that it is a wonderful, sort of compilation of things that look that really help all of us and help hopefully alleviate some of those impacts, including displacing people that live on the coast.
Sorry, Matt, there's another Matt also who can specifically address that also, and that's what I want to ask you right now about.
Sure. My office, the Office of Community Development, is working with the Ile-de-Jean-Charles community in Lower Terrebonne Parish, and it's an island that we know will either disappear within the next 50 years or upon next significant tropical impact. So under a scenario of clear and present danger, we need to have some type of model by which we can pick up an entire community, move it somewhere that we can anticipate will be high and dry over a period of time, and help those people experience a better quality of life moving forward.
And is that something that you feel optimistic about?
I think so, yeah. I think, we understand that there are communities that probably do not have a viable future for habitation moving forward. And so if we can build a model using Ile-de-Jean-Charles, and one that could be financially sustainable without federal subsidy, then I think it's something that will be applicable not only here in the state of Louisiana, but across the country and the world as we experience these changing environments.
Liz, as you look at this entire picture, as you saw the story that Beth did, what goes through your mind?
As we talk about these environmental changes, a lot of Louisiana residents are used to hearing about coastal challenges and thinking about that as a set of environmental shifts. But the reality is that over time, this starts to impact many other facets of our daily lives. We see environmental strains and stressors heighten existing social and economic challenges in our communities. We start to see impacts to our tax bases that affect our education systems, our healthcare systems, resources for infrastructure. When we see communities dwindling because residents who can afford to move are already doing so, when we see communities growing because they're this higher, safer grounds, we also see trends that are occurring there that heighten those existing stressors. And so for me, this is really an opportunity for us to think holistically, to work with the residents who are most impacted by these challenges and really ask them how they would like to adapt over time.
All right, thank you very much for that. That is all the time we have for this portion of our show. There's much more to come, though. When we come back, we're going to be joined by a panel of experts to further explore the next wave in Louisiana's coastal restoration. Welcome back, everyone, to Louisiana Public Square. Tonight, we are discussing the 2017 Coastal Master Plan. And joining us now is our panel of experts. Bryn Haas is Chief of the Planning and Research Division of the Louisiana Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, CPRA. He has over 20 years of experience in coastal wetlands, ecology, restoration, and regulation. Also with us, Captain George Ricks. He's been a charter boat fishing guide for 18 years in Hopedale, Louisiana. In 2013, he founded the Save Louisiana Coalition, which represents the commercial and recreational fishing industry. He's been outspoken, an opponent of diversion projects. Also here, Dr. Denise Reed is Vice President for Strategic Research Initiatives at the Water Institute of the Gulf. She has studied coastal issues in the U.S. and around the world, in fact, for more than 30 years. She currently serves on the NOAA Science Advisory Board. And Mark Schleifstein is the Environment and Hurricane Reporter for NOLA.com, the Times-Picayune, and is a leader of its new Louisiana Coastal Reporting Team. He is the co-author of several award-winning series on Louisiana's coast. And before we go to our audience questions, which we'll have in just a moment, first I want to ask each of you something to grade the State Coastal Master Plan. Do it briefly, but grade it and why you think so. Mark, I'll start with you.
I'm going to give it a B, and it gets a bit of a hit because there's not enough money to fund it, but it's a significant improvement over the 2012 plan in that there are real projects in it and real plans to actually build some of those projects, and it does have enough money to at least to give a jump start to what I think right now are the most important projects, and those are the projects that will add wetlands and restoration efforts in the coast.
Dr. Denise Reed, you work in the building facility, that large campus is being built just next to the Mississippi River I-10 bridge in Baton Rouge.
Yeah, we'll be in there soon, I hope. Yeah.
Yes, you will. Your thoughts on the master plan? How would you grade it?
Well, I'm going to grade it on a curve because I used to be a university professor. And so I go all across the country thinking about restoration in different places, Florida, New York, Puget Sound, San Francisco. And what I know from going to those other places is that this plan, in terms of the detail and the analysis behind it, is way above what anybody else has. And so I'm going to give it an A on that curve. If we were grading the coast, not the plan, then clearly we wouldn't be having perhaps even a passing grade at the moment.
Right, right. Captain Ricks, your grade?
I'll grade it on the curve also. The curve being because it is a vast improvement over the 2012 master plan. It seems like the CPRA has taken some stock in our concerns on the diversions that were in the 2012 plan and have made changes in the 2017 plan. But we still have a serious issue with the diversions that are in the 17 plan. And another reason why I'm not going to give it a real high grade is because the sense of urgency that we talk about in the master plan, and yet we're dumping $1.3 billion in a project that's in 20 years we're not going to be any better off than we are right now.
All right, Bryn Haas, your grade for the master plan.
Well, I have my biases, obviously being heavily involved in development of the plan, and I think the honest answer to that question really is that the only people who will be able to truly grade this plan, and more important, frankly, than the plan, is the actions that the state takes and our partners, who are many of whom are here with us today, take as a result of having this plan in place will be our children and grandchildren. Clearly, they'll have the benefit of hindsight to know whether we have seized the tremendous opportunity that we have before us today to to have a real impact, I think, on the issues that are facing us and those people that live along our coast. So.
All right, thank you very much. Let's go back now to our audience panel, and many of them we haven't heard from yet. Mara Wood, you have a question for the panel here, and tell us about yourself a little bit first and your question.
Thank you. I work for the National Wildlife Federation and work with the Mississippi River Delta Restoration Coalition. The question I had, and it sort of circles back to what Mitch said about the socioeconomic impacts. And Captain Ricks, I know that you work with a lot of different people in some of the parishes, advising them. We're talking about urgency. Both sediment diversions and marsh creation are important parts of the master plan. What are you going to do to, with your members and the people that you advise, to get to construction on these projects, to get to a place where we can construct hopefully more quickly than 2022?
I think the Big River Coalition in 2015 showed what can be done in a short period of time. They built 2,000 acres of land down at the head of the passes under the beneficial use dredge material program, and they did it in a year's time. 2,000 acres. That's what we can do. Investing all this money, and the money we're throwing at diversions. We talked about in the video about the best investment for our coast. I don't know if the diversion issue is the diversion concept is the best investment for our coast. $1.4 billion for something, like I said before, we won't see any results in the first 20 years. We'll still be the same way we are now. I think we should invest in projects to give our coastal communities immediate protection now from storm surge. The CPRA itself did the Shell Island East project. They had a bulldozer running on where it was open water in 4 days. These are projects, when we talk about a sense of urgency, these are the kind of projects we need to do. Not invest in projects that are going to be 50 years down the line in a minute amount of land being built.
It's interesting to watch the audience as some of these answers are given. And Bob Jacobson, I sense that you might have something that you could ask that would go along with that.
Well, I could talk about the diversion issue, and I think one issue is uncertainties in the long-term projections. We talk about land building. Ultimately, I'm a fisherman. I fish out of Hopedale with Rory. What are the fishery productions going to be 20, 50 years down the road? Those are even more uncertain. But I'd also like to shift back to surge, because I'm a surge hydrologist as a practice, and that's how Mark and Denise and Bren know me. On this topic of surge, one thing looking ahead that we know, and I grade the master plan very highly, by the way, but looking ahead to the next master plan, because this is an ongoing process that we're always in, shift gears towards surge for a moment. We're facing a drastic change in the National Flood Insurance Program this summer. And I know Denise has started talking about it, and Mark and I have talked about it. What are your thoughts about how a drastic change in our flood insurance program is going to affect future planning for this state? Not so much retrospective on this master plan, but looking ahead. I see that as a real big issue with a lot of people I talk about in terms of particularly things like community sustainability and how we design flood protection. So,
who would you like to answer that?
Well, Denise and I have talked about it, and I've heard Mark talk about it, so whoever would like to.
So this is a pretty close issue to me. I live down on the coast. I live in Terrebonne Parish in Montague, probably the furthest south, maybe of anybody in the room today. And we know that after every storm down in Montague, people move, and the community is fragmenting. It's becoming less viable. The grocery store just burned down. It is not going to be rebuilt. Suddenly you get to this point where the community is just hanging on by its fingernails, a bit like some of that marsh that we study all the time. And I think Bob's point is that this change in flood insurance is just going to exacerbate that. And so I think what happens here is it's just another stressor that comes into these communities. It's something that makes it much more difficult for those people to survive. The people that can afford it are going to be okay. It's the people that can't afford it, the people who are living paycheck to paycheck. We have to work out some kind of way of helping people transition in this coast. The future is going to change. Flood insurance rates are going to change. We've got to be thinking forward about how we can help people adapt and transition, not just push back and say, no, don't change anything. Change is happening.
Mark, I think I see your mind working.
Yeah, it is. And what I'm going to say is probably something I shouldn't, but I'm going to anyway. We've studied the flood insurance program forever, since really before Katrina, back in 2002, when we did a series called Washing Away. And the reality was that Congress always appropriated money to help people survive in coastal communities, and that hasn't changed. What has changed is that there's all of a sudden this idea that people should be paying the full cost of what their insurance is. Well, the reality is that a lot of people are paying the full cost of their insurance, and the problem is that there's this big chunk of money that's in the debt of the National Flood Insurance Program that is still there from Hurricane Katrina, that is a direct result of failed levees in the New Orleans metropolitan area, where the public was not able to actually file suit against the people who caused that, the Army Corps of Engineers, and get recompense for that, which would have reduced that debt dramatically. So that's sort of overloading the system in terms of the monetary value and net worth going forward. The other problem is that climate change is also a real problem in the future and is going to increase our risk. So we have to deal with that, but I think that as we do deal with it, the reality is going to continue to be that each time we have another hurricane disaster, Congress is going to step up to the plate and put up the money and try to get people back to some sort of new normal. So we're going to have to live with a 4 or 5 year period before that next disaster occurs, where the new flood insurance process that will be put in place in the next year or so is going to be very difficult for people in the New Orleans area. Whether or not we can survive that is something that's really unclear.
We've got people who make their living on the water here and have observed the landscape change, or lack thereof, currently landscape, I guess. A.C. Cooper with the Shrimpers Association, you've got a question.
Yeah, we're a $1.3 billion industry with 15,000 jobs. The Mid-Barataria Basin diversion is going to pour out in the most productive brown shrimp area on this coast. Now, is there anything in place to supplement these fishermen when it comes to that? We know what we catch and we know about how much it's worth. What do you all have there to make sure that these fishermen take care of? She spoke about people that can't afford to get out. We took a big lick with the oil spill, the Katrina, and the Rita, and now this. How much are we going to overcome this when things like this keep coming at us?
Brent?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take that. I think, it's important to note that everything that we're looking at in the master plan is in the face of the fact that our coast is absolutely changing right now. Whether or not we implement a project like Mid-Barataria, Barrier Islands, any of the other projects along that coast. And so it's changing, and I think the fisheries are going to change along with it, to be honest with you. I think most of us would probably agree with that. So the question becomes, how do we manage that change to the best of our ability so that it's not inflicting itself, if you will, on us. And I think the master plan attempts to do that. To answer your question, I think, obviously we want to try to avoid any of those impacts where we can. We certainly, our goal is not to, impact an industry inordinately or a resource inordinately. In fact, it's just the opposite, is to support those things. So we want to try to avoid those impacts where at all possible. Where we can't, and we can work together to minimize those. Certainly we want to do those. And then of course, it was already discussed today, what do we do about it if we recognize that there are impacts? We've got to together make a decision as to whether or not, one, those impacts are worth it. Is it worth it to build the land to impact potentially an industry or a fishery? And if the decision is made that perhaps that it's worth it collectively, that's not a unilateral decision, I think, among any of us. Then the question becomes what you asked, I believe, which is, how do we ease that transition, perhaps? And if not ease that transition, then how do we, support that community that perhaps relies on that resource moving into the future?
Commercial and recreation fishing industry, a $4.1 billion a year industry. 1 out of every 43 jobs in the state of Louisiana is directly connected to the commercial fishing industry. When we started our organization, that's why we called it the Save Louisiana Coalition, not to save the fishermen, save the Louisiana Coalition, because the impacts from these diversions are going to affect the whole state. Our state's having an economic issue right now. It's going to be when we lose tax bases from our commercial fishing industry, our seafood industry, which by computer models show that the diversion will, Barataria, for example, mid-Barataria, will turn the whole Barataria Basin fresh while the diversion is in operation. That's in your computer models. So, and at the time of year, you know, we're trying to do adaptive management at certain times of year to run a diversion at certain times. But if you do that, then you're not going to get the land building capabilities. You know, why spend $1.4 billion on a structure that's going to run part-time? But Barataria Estuary and Breton Sound Estuary are the two most productive estuaries in the world, not just in the United States. They're classified by the National Marine Fisheries Service as essential fish habitat, which means they're protected under the Magnuson-Stevens Act. Now, we talk about the sense of urgency and emergency declaration in the federal laws, and most of that is to get around these federal laws for the diversions, Marine Mammal Protection Act. These laws were put in place, and more, I have an issue sometimes with National Wildlife Federation. Should be concerned about dolphins, which are 2,500 are ill in Barataria Basin, and yet, you know, your organization is speaking on behalf of the diversions that will definitely harm these dolphins. So that's all issues we have. But our fishing industry is important to the economic of our state, and certain communities rely heavily. My community, St. Bernard Parish, we rely heavily on the economic tax base from our commercial, especially our oystermen, and our fishing industry, our recreational fishing industry. If we lose that, St. Bernard's out of business. Simple as that. And we're not the only one. Plaquemines will take a hit. And one other thing about the fishermen, I think it's like 48% of the commercial fishing license holders will be in these areas that's going to be affected by these two diversions.
All right, let me jump to somebody else. There's just north of New Orleans, there's what appears to be an ocean, Lake Pontchartrain. And John Lopez with the Basin Association of Lake Pontchartrain, you have a question, several I'm sure,
yeah,
but one that's you're wanting to ask.
Let me say that, first of all, the Lake Pontchartrain Basin Foundation, of course, we support the master plan. More importantly, we support the process, and that uses the science. And the science does not back what Captain Ricks was just describing. The science does say diversions work. Every place in this coast we've allowed, where water is allowed to flow into the coast, is building land. There's over 9 places it's building land right now as water is flowing. The coast was built by the Delta in spite of faults. In subsidence, it built land. It can still do it. It's ridiculous that we have these objections when the science shows that there's certainty that we can build land with the river. And there will be fisheries. The modeling shows that we'll have oysters, we'll have shrimp. Yes, people will be impacted. My father was my grandfather was a New Orleans policeman. I don't feel I have special rights because he was a policeman 50 years ago. We all pay taxes, we all have equal rights. I don't believe that the fishermen have more rights than anybody else in this state.
John Lopez, what question did you have you wanted to ask?
What's at stake? That was my question. And I know we kind of all talk about like terribleness, you know, with inaction, but like what do we think will happen in the next 5 years, 10 years if we don't do something? What's kind of the things, Denise, I think you were alluding to some of that.
Well, I think that one of the things that is good about the plan and is this idea that we now can really think about the future and anticipate the change that's going to happen if we do something or if we don't do something. And so, I mean, we are now in a really good place in Louisiana. We have a system across the coast, 300 monitoring stations across the Louisiana coast. That is unheard of across the country. Coast-wide reference monitoring system. We have 40 or 50 years of data from Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries where they've been going out and they've been seining and trawling in the same place, you know, month after month, season after season for years. We know a lot about this system. We've been able to use all of that information and really help to think about what's going to happen if we do this diversion, but most importantly, what's going to happen if we don't do any of this. And what we see is frankly horrific.
Mark,
it really is awful.
Mark Slefstein with the Times-Picayune, you're nodding.
Yes. Yeah, I am nodding, and we saw that back in in '97 when we did our series Oceans of Trouble. One of the first things that we did when we started that series was we looked at, well, gee, what's going to happen to fishing in 50 years, 100 years? And we talked to a bunch of different fishermen and scientists, and they all said the same thing. Well, we've got management of the industry now. It seems to be working. The Gulf of Mexico is stable now. It's really nice. And then we asked them just one question. Well, what happens if the wetlands continue to disappear in Louisiana at the same rate that they're happening now? They said, oh, well, fisheries won't exist. And that's the concern, is that if sea level rise, and that was before the huge amount of sea level rise that we're looking at today, potential, if that potential sea level rise occurs, we're going to be looking at walled cities in New Orleans and other places along the coast, and everything else will be water. And where are the fisheries going to be? Where are the wetlands that are going to be the nursery for all of those issues? Is that going to be 50 years from now? Probably not. Is it going to be 100 years from now? If nothing's done, I would say yes at this point.
Dwayne Lamb, you work with an organization, the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana. What a lovely title that is. What is your question now?
So my question concerns livelihood of citizens. First and foremost, with the land that we have, will we be able to handle another hurricane like Katrina? And another question is, will we lose money if we don't start this plan and a hurricane hits us for, say, next year? Will we lose money? Will we have to bring in more money to build our land after a large hurricane if we don't start this plan soon?
So I'm happy to tackle that one. I think the answer to your second question is yes. The price of our work hasn't gone down, and it doesn't go down because of our changing landscape as we look into the future. And so, a project now is much more economical, I think, than a project later. And that's one of the reasons for the great sense of urgency I think that we have in the state, and all of us have right now. So yes, I think that if we experience a catastrophe like we've experienced in the past in the future, and we haven't prepared well for it, we don't have a more healthy, resilient coast to be able to withstand, take the blow, if you will, from such an event, then yeah, it's gonna result in higher cost in dealing with that down the road. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence and some reports out there that suggest that obviously spending $1, it's the old ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? Spending dollars today to help alleviate some of the potential consequences of things like hurricanes into the future is a much more cost-effective way to operate than it is to try to wait on an event and react to it on the backside.
Jacques Hebert with Audubon, Louisiana. I see you nodding right now. You had a question also, probably several, but we haven't spoken to you yet, heard from you yet, so we want to hear from you, sir.
Yes, so I'm with Audubon, Louisiana, and Restore the Mississippi River Delta Coalition. Obviously, we believe that is what needs to happen, that the best chance we have at securing a future for our communities is to use the sediment and power the Mississippi River to rebuild and maintain land. And I know that the current master plan has $18 billion, I believe, set aside for marsh creation projects. I believe sediment diversions are around $6 billion, if I'm correct. So I'm just curious, in thinking about a future without sediment diversions, what happens to those marsh creation projects, to those levees, to those investments that are made in Plaquemines Parish and St. Bernard, Orleans, and elsewhere, unless we have sediment diversions online?
Well, they don't last as long. Is the short and sweet answer to that, I guess. The issue is, and certainly we agree with Captain Ricks and others, that we've got to get projects on the ground now. We've got to build those marshes now. We need benefits in the work that we do now. But we've also got a tremendous opportunity, as I alluded to in my opening comment there, to do some real good for the long term, not just for us and for our children, but for our grandchildren, and to really affect what our coast looks like into the future. Again, not just in terms of short-term benefits, but in terms of how we can impact that for the long term. And I think, frankly, it would be irresponsible for us to think otherwise. There has to be a balance between those short-term benefits and long-term benefits. And simply pumping and dredging sediment is a very effective restoration tool. There's no question about it. It's essentially what we've spent all of our money on to date in terms of the restoration program. As you pointed out, about $18 to $20 billion within our plan right now is dedicated to doing just that. We believe it's important. If that doesn't, that should be clear and present evidence that that's the case. But if we don't do anything to fundamentally alter the issues that are causing our land loss in the first place, one of the major factors of which is the separation of our rivers from its deltaic plain, then perhaps we're not investing those dollars as wisely as we could.
One of the things that should not be a surprise to anybody is to see diversions in the plan. I've lived in coastal Louisiana for 30 years and worked on plan after plan after plan since the first QIPRA restoration plan in 1993. And they have all talked about diverting the Mississippi River water and sediment into the estuary to build land. That should not be a surprise that this is a linchpin of the plan. It was in 2012 and it is in 2017. But the key thing here is that it's not the only thing in the plan. And the 800 square miles of benefit, I think it's 800 square miles, Bran, that is shown in the master plan document, that is not just from diversions, that is from the combined effect of building that marsh with that dredge material, building it soon, and then as it gradually subsides over time and as sea level rises, then the diversion starts to come in and nourishes it and keeps that land going. It's really all of these things going together that give us the benefit that the plan provides. And so it's not about this or that. This is a crisis. We've got to throw everything at this. And so this idea that we can just sit around and debate about whether this is the best thing or this is the best thing to do, the time for that is long gone. If any of these sea level rise projections that we analyzed in the master plan come true, particularly the medium or the high scenario, then really this coast is going to change dramatically. The salinity, high salinity, is going to be all the way up Barataria Bay into the West Bank. We're going to need some way of getting some fresh water out there to even maintain some kind of estuarine gradient. It's going to be really tough in the future. We just have to do, if we have to do everything in that plan and more, if we can find the money.
Dr. Linda Bowie, your question.
I just completed a project looking at the whole food web in areas where diversions are happening. We asked questions about what was happening to the fish, the insects, the birds, the whole food web, so we could look at this. And we also look at what's going on in other places. I just got back from Vietnam, looking in the Red River Delta, the Mekong Delta, and I've studied the Guadalquivir River, and so we know that they have dealt with some similar problems. So what I'd like to know is, so I have a lot of really ideas about how we can incorporate some of the concerns that the fishers have, the shrimpers, the oysters, by incorporating multi-trophic, extensive, not intensive, but extensive multi-trophic aquaculture. And so in the building of the marsh, can we create some fisheries and use some pumps like they do in the Guadalquivir River in Vela La Palma to create some fisheries and create jobs and create an economic engine to, and then use the diversions like Denise was saying. Can we do that? Can we kind of look to see what's been successful at other places?
Bren, you want to tackle that?
Sure. So again, the short answer I think is yes. We'd be foolish not to take a look at what's working and what's been successful in other parts of the world, other parts of the country, and look at ways that we can incorporate those techniques here. So yeah, I think that absolutely is possible, and it gets a little bit to what the way I was trying to address the answer earlier. Certainly, we would like to avoid impacts if we can, but clearly there will be some, whether we implement projects or not, and where there are, we need to look for creative ways to try to make people whole, make sure that we can live and continue to work along our coast. Absolutely.
We've shown that the species are there in over the salinity gradient, and we might have to manipulate that higher salinity in some areas and the lower salinities in some areas. I like Denise's idea of just incorporating lots of different things, but I think we need to also incorporate a working fishery. And I think we can look throughout the world and see that we can do that.
But Denise, isn't that the answer, to incorporate a lot of different things?
Well, I think it is. And deltas around the world are really highly productive places, as Mr. Rick says here. And this is, food is going to be a major global issue, right, in decades to come. And these are like the bread baskets of the world, the deltas. This is still going to be a highly productive system if you look at Southeast Louisiana as a whole, that productivity is not going to go away. It's going to not exactly be in the same place or in the same kind as it is now. We've got to harness that. We've got to harness that and make the most of that. We've been doing that, for generations. And I think we have to continue to do that for generations into the future, just in a slightly different way to kind of make the most of what we can get out of this as it changes.
But of course, Mark, it takes money to do that, right?
It does, and that's again, I get back to my B grade, and we heard earlier somebody talking about land and whether or not we're going to be able to protect our land from some of the issues involving hurricanes, and that's one of the key problems with this version of the plan, this 5 years, is that we do not have enough money going into levees. There's an ambitious plan for several new levees in this version of the master plan, which have not been looked at before, and they're all very expensive. And there's no money that I can see in the plan to pay for them. So finding that money is going to be a problem. In addition to finding out whether or not those levee systems can be built without damaging what remains of our wetlands.
Well, City Coffee with the America's Wetland Foundation, of course, money with AWF has been one of the big things that you guys have urged the private sector to give money. We're talking about we have $20 million from BP, but we need 50, but it's really going to be 150 10 years from now, and who knows what it would really be. Your question, and also maybe a comment to that.
It's highly unlikely, I would think, for companies of any kind just to write checks to the government to do projects. That's just not feasible. That's not probably ever going to happen. So we have to be able to find pathways that make sense and serve them on the business side as well, protecting critical infrastructure at the same time. We're protecting the environment, or we're building a marsh or whatever. And there are plenty of transitional projects. We see it as transitional projects that are very consistent with the master plan, maybe not major master plan projects, where this could start taking place and hold the tab for those larger projects to come along.
Right. I'd like to get some final thoughts from each of our panelists now. Bren, we can start with you.
Sure. I'd like to say that we're very proud of the work that we've done. I think we're very proud of the master plan that is on the ground today, if you will, or out for review today. I think that it's extremely important to note that whether we implement the projects in the plan as it stands today or not, that our coast, again, as I mentioned in I think the opening segment, is going to be a much, much different place than it is today. And that's really something that we all have to remember as we're having these discussions and these conversations, because the reality of our coast today is not going to be the reality of our coast tomorrow, or again, whether or not we implement a project or a suite of projects, or don't. And that really is the impetus, I think, for trying to make the best decisions that we possibly can to make the best investments in our coast for the future.
Captain Ricks?
I'd like to commend Brennan and CPRA for the work they've done, the hard work they've done in the master plan. Like I say, I don't agree with a lot of the diversion issues and some of the stuff in the master plan. I'd take kind of homage to what Dr. Lopez said. I don't think anybody said that the fishermen have any more rights than anybody else, but you have a right as a coastal resident to see that this money in this master plan is spent, as Brent said, the best investment possible. And you say about the science and utilizing the river, and wherever the river is touched, it's built land. Carnarvon diversion, the Delaware area suffered 55 square miles after Hurricane Katrina of devastation that hasn't come back yet after Katrina. But there is scientific studies that have said that it was caused by the overload of nitrates and river water over Spartina brackish water marsh. In fact, Dr. Reed at our Rumble in the Parish meeting said when you flood organic marsh, organic soil with that much river water, it could be problematic. So
okay, let me stop you there, because we want to hear from Dr. Reed.
Yes,
and Mark also.
I can go
Dr.
on
Reed, we could all go on for hours. Dr. Reed with the Water Campus?
Well, I think that I want to say it's been a great privilege to work with a big team of modelers on the 2017 Coastal Master Plan. And I think the main thing that I want to convey is that I think, and I know really, that Louisiana is in the lead on this. We've been working on this for a long time. We all know each other really well, and I think that's actually a credit to us that we do work together, right, George? Because we know this is such a serious problem. Back in 2000, when the Everglades plan was passed, we all envied them. I tell you, people envy the Coastal Master Plan here in Louisiana. The scientific basis, the forward thinking that's in it. We are in the lead. We are starting to transition communities. We have funds to actually relocate communities to safer places. We are in a leadership role here. We just got to get on and do it.
And Mark Slefstein, you're covering that.
Sure. Well, 10 years ago, we wrote a series called Losing Louisiana, where we said if things didn't start within the next 10 years, we may as well write it off. Things have started. Things, even before the 2017 version of the master plan, the projects, the pipeline projects have been a key beginning of this process of moving forward. Now it's up to all of us to make sure that the money is well spent and that it does what it does, and that we change things when we figure out where things are going wrong, and we pour money in where things are going right.
We have actually run out of time now for our question and answer segment. I certainly want to thank our audience and our panelists, Mr. Haas, Captain Ricks, Dr. Reed, and Mr. Slefstein, for their insights on this month's topic. When we come back, we're going to have a few closing comments.
What a fascinating conversation, Andre. We could
absolutely.
talk about it for a long time.
We could talk for weeks, but we need to take action.
But I'm impressed with the in-depth study and all the research, and that all of the players are in the room talking about it. But implementation and getting the funds to accomplish, that's always the question.
Louisiana is in the leadership.
Absolutely. Well, that's all the time we have for this edition of Louisiana Public Square. We encourage you to visit our website at lpb.org/public square. You can view the master plan, the Audubon Society survey, and the governor's proclamation. While you're there, comment on tonight's show. We'd love to hear from you.
We sure would. Well, Louisiana is the prison capital of the world. How about that? But what can we do to fix that? Next month, Louisiana Public Square explores proposed legislation to attack the state's mass incarceration problem. Catch Reforming Criminal Justice. That's going to be on Wednesday, May 24th. Thanks so much for watching us, and have a great night.
Good night, everyone.
For a copy of this program, call 1-800-973-7246 or go online to www.lpb.org.
Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and from viewers like you.